Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. The answer, my friend, it's about wind pollination. The answer is blowing on the wind today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is James Stevenson, and I'm with the University of Florida IFAS Extension Services here in Pinellas County. I have the great pleasure of working at Brooker Creek Preserve, which is the largest preserve in Pinellas County, up here in the north of the county, where you can come and visit just about every single native plant and animal species that still exists in Pinellas County. You can see them growing wild, living wild, and unencumbered with the stressors of trying to live in a developed area. Our preserve is almost 9,000 acres, which by preserve standards is kind of small. But for our tiny little county, it is the most important, and it is certainly a great percentage of our available wild area still left for our native plant and animal species. If you have any questions, comments, or complaints about or during today's presentation, you can either drop me an email. My email address is here, jstevenson@pinellas.gov, or do avail yourselves of the chat or the Q&A functions, which should be available to you on the toolbar. Hopefully that you can find those if you have any questions. Certainly welcome them throughout. So thanks again for joining us today. As a part of Extension, it is, of course, our mission to extend research-based information from the University of Florida to the good citizens of our county to help make decisions that are well-informed. And we do this not just because we're good people and honest people, but the decisions that you inevitably make could have an impact on the health and well-being of our natural areas. So appreciating what's going on in the world, understanding and tolerating certain things can help you be a better environmental citizen and make choices that will only help to improve and preserve our natural resources here in our area. So we weren't expecting very many people today, to be honest. Seems like kind of a niche topic, doesn't it? Wind pollination. You're really going to take an hour out of your day to talk about wind pollination? Well, I welcome you diehards, and I hope that you will pick up something today that will be useful, will be informative, will be entertaining also as well. But let's start off with a great big $10 word for wind pollination. This is going to make you very famous amongst your group. Anemophily. Anemophily means wind pollinated. Literally means wind loving. So the plants that use the wind to send their love notes from the male plants to the female plants are anemophilous species. That's the big word. Might be worth putting on the refrigerator for remembering later. I don't know, maybe not. So in order to approach the subject of wind pollination, as I do, I'm going to break it into what I hope will be some very easily digestible parts. We'll understand pollen to begin with, and we will understand pollination via different pollinators, right? What exactly does pollination mean? We've heard of pollen, we've heard of pollinators. What is pollination, though? Let's take a look at that. And then we will be able to put all the parts together to better understand why We are plagued yearly with pollen all over everything. Pollen becomes quite distracting to us and our lives every year. Those of us who suffer from seasonal allergies, that's because of the seasonal arrival of pollen. What is it? Well, we know that pollen has a bad reputation. We know that there's a pollen forecast on my local news so that we can plan our sneezing events, apparently, around our outdoor activities because of pollen. Might also, if you have ever had the opportunity to work around maybe cut flowers, or if you're a gardener, flowers out in the landscape, that flowers do have pollen, and it's like dust. And in some cases, this dust can be dislodged from the flower. That's actually what it's supposed to do. But when you're handling a cut flower, something like that, I know that lilies and amaryllis are two culprits for having pollen-bearing structures called anthers. The pollen can get on things. So you might have noticed that. You might have actually physically come into contact from pollen originating from its very source. We also know that pollen gets on pollinators. We know that there is some relationship between bees and pollen. Bees transfer pollen, bees carry pollen, bees collect pollen intentionally. But as you'll see in this photograph here, a typical photograph of a typical wild bee, this bee is more accidentally collecting pollen than intentionally collecting pollen. Bees and other effective pollinators are generally covered in hairs. They're usually, most often, sensory hairs. But the plants can take advantage of those sensory hairs and they can throw their pollen in it where it will get stuck. Bees that intentionally collect pollen will collect that pollen and put that pollen into special structures on their legs that is meant to carry pollen. Pollen is made of protein, and it's very nutrient dense for its size. So pollen is used as a food source for certain organisms. And the bees that collect pollen can actually mix it with the flower nectar that bees also collect and make this wonderful paste, this nutritious, high in sugar, high in protein paste to feed their developing young. So pollen for bees and other insects is a source of nutrition. Pollen for the plant is half of a message of creation. Pollen has to combine with a cell inside of a pollen grain has to combine with a cell inside of another plant to become the next generation. Pollinators, as we mentioned before, are generally the fuzzier, hairier insects. Especially the flowering plants were very good at co-opting the flight of insects for their own, the plants, that is, for the plants' purposes. Plants can't fly, but the insects can. So especially and almost exclusively the flowering plants used insect wings to transfer that sexual message across great distances. There are other insects that we associate with flowers and that we might mistake for pollinators that are more interested in the nectar. Nectar is sugar and water, just energy drink. And insects like the moths and the butterflies, they have the specially modified mouth parts that act like a very long, slender siphon. And they can draw nectar up out of flowers without getting down and dirty into the flowers. So butterflies and moths can really avoid pollen altogether, and oftentimes they do. Not to say that butterflies and moths aren't pollinators, but they're not very good pollinators. They're not very effective by and large. So just appreciating that. Some people will ask when the subject of pollination and pollinators comes up. I have been asked several times, what about bats? Because I suppose there's been enough nature programming, nature shows, where you see bats flying from cactus flower to cactus flower, let's say, at night when bats are generally active. And it's their activity of nectar harvesting and their fuzzy bodies that are the effective pollen transfer mechanism. Well, we do not have any native bat pollinated species. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that an exotic plant that has been brought into cultivation from another place, Central South America, let's say, a cactus from Central and South America, or from even the Western United States, which in the wild is pollinated by bats. If that plant is unnaturally brought into Florida and grown as an ornamental plant in a pot, it's not outside the realm of possibilities that one of our local bats might discover that. But it's not what our local native bats are actually looking for. So we do not have a really well-established native bat plant interaction system here in Central Florida. The reason I bring that up is, for some reason, historically, that's come up. Anytime I mention pollination, someone wants to know about the bat. So there you have it. So pollinators, ultimate, include the very non-living wind. Do you remember what wind pollination is called? Anemophily. Wind pollination is a very, I'll say, inexpensive way to facilitate this necessary transfer of half of a sexual message. There is no need for wind-pollinated plants to produce flowers because there's no pollinator with vision that's being attracted. So save money on not producing petals. There's no reason to produce nectar because the wind doesn't eat. So save money on petals, save money on nectar production. Those savings can go into the production of more smaller flowers, which can increase the chances of creating viable embryos, which will be the next generation of plants. Now, pollination itself, of course, is the transfer and eventual arrival of pollen from one plant to another. The pollination is that arrival. When a flower or a pine cone is pollinated, the pollen has arrived. Half of the sexual message is now at the door. And this is a longitudinal section through a flowering plant. And there are the pollen-producing structures, which we saw isolated a few slides back. These are the anthers that produce pollen. And in the very center of the flower, in flowering plants and only flowering plants, in the very center, there's this critical organ called the pistil. At the very tip of the pistil, there is this sticky, spongy surface called, it has a name because it has to have a name because this is science, it happens to be called the stigma, the spot. And that is where the pollen arrives. Pollination happens when the pollen arrives in flowering plants to the stigma. Generally speaking, an individual flower, like the one that we have in this drawing here, generally speaking, an individual flower will time the ripening of the pollen and the receptivity of the stigma different from one another. So an individual flower is unlikely in most cases to pollinate itself. Does that make sense? So the pollen in this cartoon drawing, let's say the stigma, excuse me, let's say the stigma is receptive and pollen is coming in from an outside source. In most species of flower, if the stigma is receptive, the pollen on that individual flower is not being shed. It's not ripe yet, or it's long gone. So plants really do try and prevent self-pollination. It's not unheard of course not. There's no exacts, but generally speaking, it's the best case scenario for these two events to be separated in time. The pollen arrives on the stigma, and in our conifers, which also produce pollen, that pollen arrives onto the female cone. Here we have an electron micrograph of some pollen grains, actual pollen grains sitting on an actual stigma of a flower. So this is the pollination part. It's happened. It's successful. The right pollen from the right species has got to the right correct stigma of the correct species. That's pollination. In the conifers, this is the pollen has to arrive not on a flower, but on a female cone. So we all know that the pine trees, well, hopefully most of us know, if you don't know, pine trees produce quite a lot of pollen in the spring. And it is released into the atmosphere, and it has to find a female cone. It's got half of that sexual message. Once it arrives at the female cone, the magic of fertilization then happens. But the transfer of the pollen from the male cones to the female cones is the pollination act. The pollen grain, an individual pollen grain, and we'll look at this up close in just a second. Individual pollen grains in the pines, they actually have little wings, so they can fly, and they can fly to the female cone and find that egg cell, fertilize that egg cell, and make a seed that'll be next year's pine tree. Okay? That's the birds and the bees and the wind. We'll get now more into why, again, begging the question, so why again, tell me again why we have to suffer every spring with all these clouds of pollen? Having looked at pollen itself as this messenger and the methods that plants employ, the entities that plants employ as pollinators, insects, mammals, the wind, and pollination being the transfer of this pollen. When we speak of pollination, only 2 of the big 4 plant groups are involved. We've mentioned them both hitherto, but if you've been to any of these lectures before, we tend to return time and time again to the big 4 groups of plants: the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms or the conifers, and the flowering plants. Now, the mosses and the ferns, they reproduce by spores. There's no pollination in the mosses or the ferns ever. There just isn't. Those plant groups do not produce pollen. Pollen is found only in the gymnosperms and the flowering plants. The gymnosperms being the conifers. You can almost one-to-one use those words interchangeably. So pollen is only found there. The ferns, they have spores. The spores are released. They also are like dust, like pollen, but it's not the same thing. It is also a wind-driven event, the release of spores into the wind, but it's not pollen. It's not pollination. Pollen belongs initially to the group of plants that developed from a common ancestor with the ferns. So where ferns produce their spore-producing structures on their leaves, the gymnosperms, the conifers, produced short branches with little leaves that had their reproductive structures on them that over millions of years were reduced into what eventually became and are still today the cones. They're sometimes referred to as strobili, which means a repeating pattern, like a strobe light. So a cone is a strobilus. And there are male cones that produce this wonderful invention called pollen. And there are female cones, which of course are responsible for the ripening, the maturation, and the release of the seeds. Male cones are produced once a year. Female cones are produced once a year, so that when the male cones are mature, like you've seen here, and the pollen is released, the pollen will be leaving the male cones in search of, completely by chance, in wind-pollinated plants, completely by chance, finding a female cone. And we've all seen, well, I keep saying we've all seen and we all know. Let me just, perhaps you've seen a lot of these little, brittle caterpillary looking things towards the middle and end of spring, just finishing up now. These tiny little, like I said, they're brittle and dry. These are the male cones spent of their pollen cargo and are of no more use to the plant. So the plant just drops them. We're not supporting you anymore. We produced you, you ripened your pollen, you shed your pollen, and we're done with you. And so these structures, these male cones, these strobili fall off the plant, only to be produced anew next year. Before they leave the plant, though, they have to release their pollen, their cargo, their message. And pines, which are the most predominant of the gymnosperms in our area, Central Florida, their pollen, I think I showed you before, has these little wings. They are saccate, like little bags with wings, little sacs with wings. And the lighter color in this photograph, each one of these is a pollen grain. And the lighter color is the business part of the pollen grain that contains just 3 or 4 cells. It's a very simple structure. One of those cells is the critical sperm cell that's going to unite with the egg once the pollen finds its way, hopefully by chance, to a female cone. The other cells are responsible for growing, germinating, and seeking out the egg cell once they have landed on the female cone. Here's a super close-up of the pollen grain of a pine tree and those different types of cells. The generative cell and the tube cell are going to do the searching. They're going to germinate and divide and grow through the female cone to find the egg. The prothalial cells include one that has the sex message, the half the sex message that will unite with the female egg cell to make the embryo. Other gymnosperms that produce cones or don't. Number A here is ginkgo. We don't have ginkgo in our area, but if you're familiar with ginkgo, you know they make something that looks like a berry, looks like a fruit, looks like a apricot even. Despite the fact that they're not flowering plants, it's not a fruit, it's a gymnosperm. It's single seed, it's single egg inside of that structure produces this thing called a pollination droplet. And in the yew tree, each egg produces here a pollination droplet. In a juniper, there are 3 egg cells, each one of them producing this pollination droplet. And in a cypress, a small immature female cypress cone with all of these different egg cells, each one making a pollination droplet. That droplet is going to grab pollen grains from the air. It's sticky and resinous. And the cool thing is, it's a trap. And the egg can then, once pollen has landed on it, it can draw that pollination droplet back inside the immature cone, let the pollen grain germinate, find the egg cell, fertilize that egg so a seed can be produced. It seems almost like too much trouble to ask, but this has been going on for a lot longer than even flowers have been on the earth. This was the preferred this was the only method of plant reproduction, higher plant reproduction, non-spore plant production until the arrival of the flowering plants. Various gymnosperm or conifer pollen have different methods of making themselves aerodynamic. We saw before the pine pollen with the two inflated wings. Other species, white cedar, hemlock, and Douglas fir, their pollen grains actually desiccate. They slightly desiccate into a thin and slightly curved configuration that is more aerodynamic and lighter weight, so that that pollen can travel further on the breeze. Now, flowering plants, which are most of what's out there, we had the mosses on land, we had the ferns develop, and then we had these gymnosperms develop. The gymnosperms took over the land from the mosses and the ferns and became the dominant land plants. And then along came the flowering plants. And the flowering plants made a deal with the insects. And like I mentioned before, the flowering plants took advantage of the insects' ability to fly, and changed the pollination game by producing these structures, these flowers, to attract the insects. So here we are being an insect, and we're approaching this patch of tulips. And this is what we see. There's something very obvious and very different, a very different set of colors and patterns against the background of all the other vegetation. And on closer inspection, even more colors and patterns that seem to be indicating a destination. So insects are attracted to all these colors and patterns, and upon arrival are given a nectar reward. And that is worth flying for. To get to that nectar reward, the insects are going to stumble across the pollen-bearing structures and are going to accidentally pick up half the sexual message of the plant, and then leave the flower, look for the same pattern and color, know exactly what they're going to get, and visit another flower of exactly the same species. And by going after that nectar reward, they will accidentally stumble across the stigmatic surface and transfer half of the sexual message, and pollination will occur. We mentioned flowering plants have the thing called the anther, where the pollen is produced. Here's the cartoon that we saw before. And in real life, you can see the pollen grains are very, very small. They have to be. Even though they don't have to take flight themselves, they still need to be quite portable. Insect-pollinated flowers are going to produce showy petals. They are going to provide some sort of pollination syndrome. In the case of this plant, this cosmos, it presents its pollen and its nectar-bearing structures on a horizontal plane so that a pollinator can see it from above and land on this nice flat surface and walk into the area where it will expect a nectar reward. Once arriving into the flower, the pollen of the flowering plants, of course, needs to adhere to the pollinator. Now, the best pollinators are going to have fuzzy bodies. They are pre-adapted to be excellent pollinators, because remember, pollination is an accidental thing from the insect's point of view. The insect has no interest, really, in intentionally collecting pollen and intentionally transferring that pollen to another flower. It's an accident. So the pollen has to get onto the pollinator. And like I was saying, the most readily pre-adapted pollinators are the ones that already had fuzzy bodies. But sometimes the pollen itself can have characteristics that allow for more efficient pollen transfer. Here we have a honeybee, and this bee is collecting nectar. It's got its face way down into the nectary. You'll notice it doesn't have a collection of pollen. The pollen that it is carrying has been accidentally adhered to its body. And by walking across all these actually several small flowers within this greater collection at the center of the cosmos flower, it's going to be transferring that pollen from a different plant. Now, for wind pollination, we mentioned that almost all of the gymnosperms are wind pollinated. So living in an area where the dominant plant diversity is gymnosperm. So the coniferous forests, the circumboreal coniferous forests, the sort of thing, higher latitudes. Those are places where the majority of the plants themselves will be wind pollinated, anemophilous, right? There are, though, flowering plants which have gone backwards and have gone from being insect pollinated back to being wind pollinated. Oaks are a flowering plant. If you think about it, they're not a moss, they're not a fern. They don't produce cones. They produce flowers. They're a flowering plant. They produce a fruit, technically, an acorn. So a few flowering plants have gone the opposite direction and become wind pollinated as well. And they too contribute to our seasonal misery if we, like me, have an allergy to the proteins associated with the pollen grains. And flowering plants have a tendency to repeat flowering, whereas the conifers, the gymnosperms, they have a one-off breeding season, if you will. They produce male cones and release pollen once a year, and they're done for the rest of the year. Flowering plants, on the other hand, depending on the group that they belong to, could continue producing airborne, anemophilous pollen throughout the year. And flowering plant pollen that is wind-borne is very often armored to stick its landing, not to stick to a pollinator, but to stick to an exposed stigma of its kind somewhere else. That armor, that those spikes and clubs and hooks that the wind-pollinated flowering plants adorn their pollen grains with to grab the aerial stigmas of the female plant, they love to grab the inside of our nose by accident. They don't love to do that. It's a total waste of pollen for them to be up our nose. It's a bummer for the plant as much as it's a bummer for us. But one of the reasons that windborne pollen is such a nuisance is that a lot of times that windborne pollen is going to have architecture on the surface of the pollen grains that can help get stuck to our nasal passages. Then if we have a sensitivity to the proteins that pollen is made of, the histamine response and the hay fever ensues. Let's take a look at some wind pollination in flowering plants. What are the requirements? For one, it's that savings, if you think about it. Reduced flowers, no need to produce nectar because the wind doesn't need feeding. No need to produce petals because the wind doesn't need attracting. So the individual flowers themselves are reduced. What you're looking at here is an inflorescence of 30 or 50 or more tiny little reduced flowers. So each one of these little scales represents an individual flower. Economy of scale. All that saved resource and not having to produce petals, all that saved resource and not having to produce nectar is put into making more smaller flowers. Wind pollination is most effective where the participants, if you will, live densely with low diversity. So a tropical rainforest is not the place to practice wind pollination. Yes, it's dense, but a jungle rainforest is going to be extremely highly diverse in species. And a jungle atmosphere is also not conducive to wind pollination. Why? Because it's so enclosed. As the earth went through its changes and continents shifted around and things got warmer and drier in certain areas, a landscape called the savanna opened up. Grassland with occasional trees. This is where the flowering plants took back wind pollination. And the grasses and the oaks are perfectly suited for this dense, low diversity landscape type. The grasses are probably the premier of the wind pollinated flowering plants on Earth. They're not the only ones, but they've certainly taken it to the max. Grass flowers are incredibly reduced. It would be hard to convince your friend that what you're looking at here is a bouquet of grass flowers. That would be very hard to convince someone of that. These are flowers that are reduced to their absolute barest minimum structures. Something to produce pollen and something to collect pollen. No petals, no nectar, no nothing else. Putting all of these structures out into the elements, as it were, is necessary to facilitate grabbing pollen from the air. You don't want to give it any sort of impediment. So the hairs on the finger grass They help to guide any wind-borne pollen down towards the sticky stigma. Lopsided Indian grass, another one of our native grasses, the rust-colored structures here, they are pointing straight down, and the wind is going to carry their pollen laterally, and it's hopefully going to brush itself in the wind up against the receptive stigma of a nearby plant, lopsided Indian grass. Many of our grains, well, all grains are grasses. Grain is just the technical word for a grass fruit. So wheat and rice and corn and oats, these are all wind-pollinated crops. And when practicing the horticulture of these crops, their pollination syndrome needs to be streamlined and unimpeded. If you've ever grown corn, perhaps you've practiced tasseling, where the male flowers of the corn are produced on the top so the wind can get them, and the female flowers condensed onto a structure called a cob. Individual flowers develop into a single kernel of corn, but not until the pollen has reached the silk of the corn ear, the silk being the elongated stigmatic surface, more or less. Wind pollination requires, of course, a copious amount of pollen production because most of it is going to be wasted. So all the savings in not producing petals, not producing nectar, allow for the copious production of pollen with an economy of scale, hoping to ensure that just some of that pollen hits its intended target. And we all know about copious amounts of pollen being produced. Synchronous flowering, of course, the pollen has to become available when a receptive individual is also in flower. So things have to be synchronized. Has to be at a time of year when the pollen is being produced at the same time as a receptive surface on another plant. And finally, the flowers have to be exposed, of course. In the corn plants, the male flowers are exposed. They are the tallest thing on the plant. They are the most likely to get the most purchase on the wind. In ragweed, these upright, vertical spires of extremely reduced flowers. This is not one flower. This is a spike of 50 flowers, 50 miniature flowers, repeated over and over and over and over again on the plant. It has these exposed flowers because it's got to drop pollen into an air stream, an air current. A feathery stigma is usually present to grab, like a duster, the pollen from the air. So what's blowing around Pinellas right now? You probably know. And thankfully, it's April now. We've come to the end of a majority of the synchronous flowering of the oaks. And just like with their gymnosperm or conifer cousins from ancestors, male oak flowers, like the male cones, the male oak flowers are temporary. This is a string of male oak flowers, and they will ripen airborne pollen, release them from the tree branches, often before new leaves are produced so that the pollen is unimpeded. And then the male flowers themselves will fall to the ground by way of our cars, usually. So these male flowers cover everything and arrange themselves into, clumps on the ground. They're done. The plant isn't dying. It's intentionally throwing these freeloaders from the branches. They've shed their pollen. Their work is done. Get out. There are female oak flowers now. Look around at the new growth on your oak trees for these tiny little lumps, often with these little puckered lips. Those are the female flowers. Again, remember, these are wind-pollinated plants. They don't need to make petals. They're not attracting anything with eyes. They're not making nectar. This is a flower that's reduced to the bare minimum necessary to be called a flower. And that's this sticky stigma and a nice fat ovary with an egg inside. So this is the female flower of an oak. That kissy lips, that's going to receive the airborne pollen. One of those boys is going to succeed in fertilizing the egg. The egg will then grow into the seed inside of the fruit, which is the acorn. These, of course, will stay attached to the plant throughout that maturation process, thanks to the right pollen getting onto the right stigma. In Pinellas County alone, we have 11 different oaks, all of which are wind pollinated. The blue jack oak, Chapman's oak, dwarf live oak. These are some of the smaller oaks of very, very dry areas, not generally left behind in housing developments. Laurel oaks, live oaks, and laurel oaks and live oaks are a couple of the trunked oaks, the taller shade trees that you might have around your sphere of influence or neighborhood or church or apartment building. Myrtle oak and running oak and sand live oak and scrub oak, those are some of the other smaller multi-stemmed oak species that live in places like the preserve and in parks, in upland habitats, but they're not necessarily landscape plants, and so we don't see a lot of those in town. Turkey oak and water oak, those are some other trunked oak species that may or may not have been left behind when developments were put in and are rarely planted as an afterthought. But so you can see there's a diversity of oak species. And with all that oak pollen floating around, and with the female flowers being nothing more than kissy lips and a big fat ovary, it is possible and probable for the pollen of one oak to land on the stigma of a different species. And both being oaks, both being relatively closely related, certainly by leaps and bounds more closely related than an oak is to a pine tree. One oak to another oak, hybridization does occur, where the pollen of one species fertilizes the egg of a different species. And a viable offspring may be created in an acorn. That acorn may find a suitable place to germinate without ever being eaten. That seedling may survive to adulthood. Chances are extremely small for all of the above, but it is not unknown to find hybrid oaks for the reason that wind pollination in closely related species is possible. Does that make sense? There's only a few pines in Pinellas, so once pine season is over, it's over. And it's over. We have the longleaf pine, the slash pine, and the sand pine. And here we have a 3-year-old female pine cone. They stay attached to the tree for 3 years before they release their seeds. In their first year, the little female cones are just a little sticky cone-like thing, grabbing pollen out of the air. 3 years later, the female cone is mature and they can shed the seeds. Wax myrtle is a wind-pollinated species. It's done. It has had its pollen drifted to the exposed female flowers, very similar to the oak flowers with the male and the female bits. The wax myrtle has had its pollination event that has gone. The chenopod's, sometimes you see that if you do watch the pollen forecasting, there's a group of plants called the chenopod's, which translates to mean the goosefoot group, or goose feet, goosefoot, chenopod. Mixed in with those, sometimes considered one whole group, are the amaranth type flowering plants. So the amaranths and the chenopods, those are wind pollinated. We have a few of these established weeds and some natives. These are also wind pollinated with a particular flowering season beginning now. So those of us who have gotten over the agony of pine season, drawing to a close with oak season, we're just at the tip and the beginning of the goosefoot and the amaranth flowering plant season. Nettles are an example of a wind-pollinated flowering plant. And you can see here, it's not pulling out any stops to make pretty flowers. It certainly doesn't need to, just the bare minimum, sending out what it needs to catch the breeze. Grasses are such a large group of flowering plants. There are grasses flowering all year long. Hay fever is a concept and a terminology that belongs to an agrarian and certainly a more temperate, more northern latitude mindset. When the grasses tend to flower towards the end of the summer, or towards the end of the spring, excuse me, hay fever season. Here in our part of Florida, we have grasses flowering almost the year round, and grasses are almost exclusively wind pollinated. Cattails look like giant grasses. They're not related to grasses, but they do utilize the wind, not only for pollination, but for the dispersal of their fruit, as many grasses do as well. Now, when we start talking about everything that's flying around in the air, not everything that's flying around in the air, like cattail fluff and like the poof off of a dandelion, this is not wind pollination. This is certainly using the wind for something, but not pollination. Pollination is long gone for the dandelion. This is wind distribution of dandelion fruit. So again, here's a plant that uses insects to pollinate. The dandelion makes a nice, pretty yellow flower, lots of nectar, very attractive to bees. So it has an insect pollinator, and then its fruit is released into the wind. So it's a wind distributed, not wind pollinated. Does that make sense? Dandelions. Just a couple of thoughts to finish up. Bad news for Central Florida, Orlando, one of the worst pollen cities in the US. And that, of course, has a lot to do with what I was mentioning before. Our climate allows for continual plant growth throughout the year. So with the diversity of flowering plant species, even though only 12% of flowering plants in the world are wind pollinated, there's usually something producing pollen into the wind year round in Central Florida. And poor old Orlando is the one that got singled out for the research and subsequently named as the worst. We do at the UF IFAS Extension in Pinellas County invite you to learn more every day. We have a lot of our lectures and presentations and informational sessions recorded on and available through our YouTube channel. All you have to do is search for IFAS Extension Pinellas County, UF IFAS Extension Pinellas County, and you will eventually land on our page, hopefully, with various categories, subject matter laid out for you. Do come and see us at Brooker Creek Preserve. If you haven't yet this year, it's a great time to come before the rainy season. Our trails are currently all exposed, and walking the entire trail system without getting in the water is completely possible. Our sister preserve, Weeden Island, another place to go and observe natural coastal Florida uninterrupted by development, where you can find the natural plants, the natural animals, native plants, native animals in their own habitats. If podcasts are your thing, you have to check out Lara's Nature Podcast, Naturally Florida Podcast.com. These are monthly, quick, easily digestible, conversational, very informative, enjoyable to listen to on a commute. It's Naturally Florida Podcast. Definitely check those out if podcast is your thing. And what's the next gift giving season? I guess it's going to have to be birthdays from now on. Give your loved one a gift that keeps giving, a copy of This or That, Beginner's Guide to Commonly Misidentified Plants and Animals in Florida, a book produced here by Lara and I at Brooker Creek Preserve for Florida, of species that are very often misidentified or confused for one another. Important to make certain differences, especially when you're looking at dangerous species or invasive species and so on. Anyway, I thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. If I don't see we have any questions, if you do, type them right quick. I'm going to get a drink of water and we're going to launch a poll. We are always searching to improve our presentations, and your input is always very, very welcome in that endeavor of giving us a little bit of feedback, as it were. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have any questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A. Quick tap on our post-webinar poll. And I really appreciate your attention this afternoon. And we hope to see you next month.